He wasn't supposed to be there. Julien had opened his laptop at 2:58 p.m., half distracted, sipping lukewarm coffee, ready for another tedious team meeting on Zoom. A Slack notification had just popped up. Zoom 3 p.m., and he clicked it without thinking. The camera flicked on. His name appeared center screen. Everything looked normal until it didn't. There were no slides, no colleagues, no banter, just silence. Faces, tear-streaked, mourning. At first, Julien assumed it was some kind of corporate mental health check-in. Maybe someone in HR was trying something new. People cried in meetings all the time now. But then he heard the voice. "We gather here today to remember Daniel Marchand." He froze. He didn't know a Daniel Marchand, but his face, fully lit and politely alert, had already been noticed. He couldn't leave without drawing attention, so Julien made a decision. He stayed. For the next 45 minutes, he nodded solemnly. He lowered his eyes with intention. He pressed a hand to his chest at just the right moments. And when a woman named Claire recounted how Daniel once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to deliver cold medicine, Julien whispered, almost involuntarily. He had a good heart. The worst part, people believed him. At the end of the service, someone said, "We're so glad Daniel had work friends like you. It means a lot." Another voice chimed in. "You must have known him from the early startup days." Julien nodded. It was easier than correcting them. The lie had already taken root. He typed in the Zoom chat. He made people feel seen. Then came the message that changed everything. It was short, just a single DM from a woman named Isabelle Julien. "I'm so grateful you came. Daniel always talked about you." He stared at the screen, stunned. He had never met Daniel Marchand, at least not by name, but suddenly about him, the name felt familiar in a way that words can't explain. It lingered like the face of someone glimpsed in a dream. Not someone close and toes, but not a stranger either. Julien couldn't remember how the meeting ended. He only knew that when he finally closed his laptop, his heart was beating faster than it should have been. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the faces he saw, the stories he heard, and the quiet way his presence had been folded into their grief. He should have left, but something beneath the surface kept him tethered. The next morning, Julien did something he didn't understand. He sent flowers to Daniel's family, a simple white arrangement, no dramatic flair, just a card. From the early days team, he still didn't know why he did it, but deep down, he felt like he owed Daniel something more than borrowed grief and well-timed nods. At first, he thought that would be the end of it, but the lie he told had only just begun to unravel, and buried beneath that quiet, accidental funeral was a truth he had been trying to forget for years. He didn't know Daniel, but Daniel had known him. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a fear, a secret you haven't said out loud, don't go anywhere. Because what happens next will change the way you think about love, memory, and the people who pass through our lives without saying a word. Subscribe to Heart Stories to hear next part and more stories like this, based on real heartbreak, quiet redemption, and the things we almost said. Julien didn't expect to hear from them again. He had played his part in silence, closed the laptop, and tried to return to his quiet, predictable life. But 3 days later, a message arrived. It was from Claire, the woman who had spoken during the service about Daniel's 4-hour drive through a snowstorm. She introduced herself properly this time, told Julien she was Daniel's cousin, and then she invited him for coffee. He almost declined, but something pulled him forward. They met at a small cafe near Jardin de Luxembourg. Claire was soft-spoken, her words careful, as if each syllable still carried grief. She said Daniel's mother, Isabelle, remembered Julien from years ago, from a time when Daniel still smiled easily, from when he used to visit a bookstore near the park almost every week. Julien felt his breath catch. That was his bookstore, the one with dusty corners, golden afternoon light, and a quiet reading nook beside the window. The place he visited every Thursday at 5 o'clock, always with a paperback in hand and headphones he never actually used. A place he once thought of as his sanctuary. He remembered a boy, dark hair, a soft jawline, always seated one table over, never speaking, just watching, smiling when their eyes accidentally met. A face Julien never approached. A presence he ignored not because he didn't notice, but because he had convinced himself that noticing would be dangerous. It had been a different time. Julien wasn't out to his family then. His job was unstable, his friendships were fragile, and the idea of letting anyone that close, especially another man who looked at him like he already knew, was terrifying. Claire sipped her tea. "He never said your name," she admitted, "but he used to sketch you. There are notebooks filled with outlines of a man reading by a window, always in the same position, always on a Thursday." Julien couldn't speak. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept them folded on the table. "He called you the boy in the light," Claire added. "He said you made him feel brave just by existing." It didn't make sense. How could someone know so much and say so little? Julien had always thought of that bookstore boy as a fleeting crush, a maybe. But to Daniel, he had been something more, an idea, a hope, a secret love too delicate to name. Claire slid an envelope across the table. "I found this in his apartment. It's not addressed to anyone, but my aunt thought you should see it." Julien opened it with hesitant fingers. Inside was a short letter. The handwriting was slanted, full of pauses, like the writer had second-guessed every word. "You'll never read this, but if you do, I want you to know I saw you. Not just once. Every Thursday, you were calm when I couldn't be. You were light when everything around me felt heavy. I didn't need you to notice me. I just needed you to stay. Thank you. D." The calf disappeared around him. Julien sat with his eyes closed. The words pressed against his fingertips like a pulse he never knew he had. He had spent years believing no one had ever truly seen him. But someone had, quietly, without permission, without expectation. And now that someone was gone, he felt grief rise, not the polite kind he had faked on Zoom, but the quiet ache of something he hadn't known he lost until it was far too late. Claire reached across the table and touched his hand. "I think," she said, "you were his beginning, not the middle, not the end, just the spark." Julien left the calf with the envelope tucked close to his chest. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know if he deserved it, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. Daniel had kept him close in silence. Now Julien was the only one who could speak his truth out loud, and that truth was only just beginning to reveal itself. The door opened with a gentle creak, as if even the house itself was reluctant to disturb what Daniel had left behind. Julien hesitated on the threshold. Isabel, standing beside him, gave a quiet nod, then stepped away to let him enter alone. Daniel's bedroom was simple, neat, almost untouched. The kind of room where everything had a place, and nothing was loud. A bed with a gray wool blanket, a wooden desk, polished but lived in. Light poured in from the left window, casting a muted glow across the room. It felt warm, still, like someone might return at any moment to sit quietly at the edge of the bed. Julien stepped forward, unsure what he was even looking for. There were no photos of them, of course not. There had never been a them, but the books on the shelf were familiar. Some were titles Julien remembered reading during those bookstore afternoons. A few even had folded corners, tiny pencil marks in the margins. Daniel had underlined quotes about longing, about silence, about the weight of words unsaid. It wasn't until Julien reached the desk that he found it. A sketchbook, half open, lay beneath a stack of papers. Inside, dozens of pencil drawings. Most were loose, unfinished, but every face, every curve of light and shoulder belonged to Julien. The lines were soft but precise, drawn from memory, not photographs. Different outfits, different seasons, the same face, his, Then, tucked into the back pocket of the sketchbook, folded twice and sealed with a paper clip, was a second letter. This one was addressed, in careful, full handwriting, to Julien. He stared at the name. The letter hadn't been mailed, hadn't even been sealed, but the ink was dry and the fold lines worn, as if it had been read over and over by the one who wrote it. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Julien, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe I'm writing it just to pretend I'm brave. Maybe I'll finally hand it to you someday. Or maybe I'll just carry it with me until I forget how to let go. You never spoke to me. I don't blame you. I wasn't someone people noticed, not really. But I noticed you. You were always there before sunset, always in the same spot, with your headphones on, but never turned on. I thought that was clever. I wanted to say something. I almost did. Once, you dropped your bookmark and I picked it up. But by the time I stood, you were already gone. I kept it. I've written this letter 100 times in my head, but every version sounds too much or too little. You'll never know what it meant to just exist near you. You didn't have to do anything. You just had to be. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if that's true, then this is the safest moment I've ever had. I loved you in the smallest, kindest, quietest way. Daniel, Julien pressed the letter to his chest. He didn't cry at first. There was only stillness, like his body did not know how to process a truth too large to carry and too fragile to speak. But eventually the tears came, not from guilt, not even regret, just from the unbearable weight of being seen so clearly by someone who asked for nothing in return. He remembered the bookmark. It had been a scrap of an old train ticket, tucked between the pages of a worn novel. He hadn't even realized it was missing, but someone had picked it up and kept it for years. That tiny, insignificant moment preserved by someone who never stopped hoping for a different ending. Behind him, the floor creaked. Isabel stood at the doorway, holding something small in her hand. "I think this belongs to you," she said gently. She held out a thin frame. Inside was the bookmark, pressed flat, framed as if it were a masterpiece. "He never let me throw it away," she said. Julien reached for it with both hands. It felt absurdly light. He looked around the room once more at the drawings, the desk, the sunlight, and realized that Daniel had lived with more courage and silence than most people manage aloud. He had made peace with never being noticed, and still chose to remember with tenderness. This room wasn't a shrine. It was a conversation. One Julien had arrived too late to answer, but it wasn't over yet. The day of the reading arrived with gray skies and wind that bent the trees in half. Julien stood outside the notary's office, unsure if he had the right to walk in. He hadn't been family. He hadn't even been a friend. He had shown up at Daniel's funeral by mistake and stayed out of guilt, curiosity, maybe even longing. But now he was back, summoned by Isabel herself, because Daniel had included his name in something that should have been private. Inside, the room was still and formal. Isabel sat beside Claire, her face calm but pale. Across from them, Daniel's father, Grard, gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Two of Daniel's aunts whispered to each other as Julien entered. The air tightened around him. The notary, a lean man with sharp glasses and a neutral expression, began reading. It started with the expected property, possessions, formal acknowledgments. Then came the pause. "And for the remainder of my assets, including financial accounts and my shares in Luminet Labs, I leave full ownership to..." He looked up. Julien Lefebvre. The silence broke like glass. Grard stood abruptly. "This is a joke," he barked. He turned to Isabel. "You allowed this." She didn't flinch. It was Daniel's decision. Julien couldn't move, couldn't speak. The words sounded foreign, like they belonged to someone else. He hadn't known Daniel. Not really. And yet the man had just handed him the weight of a life he had barely brushed. The notary continued. reading Daniel's personal note aloud. To Julien, you didn't know me, but I knew you. You reminded me that it was okay to hope, that quiet people still matter. You were the first person who made me feel like I existed without having to prove it. This isn't a payment, it's a recognition of the small things, of how a look, a moment, a presence can change someone's direction. If this feels like too much, do what feels right. But if you keep any of it, live like you were always seen. Julien felt his throat close. He wanted to speak, to explain, to correct the assumptions. But what could he say? That he'd walked into the wrong Zoom call and stumbled into someone's legacy, that his presence in Daniel's life had been entirely accidental. Gerard's voice sliced through the room. He was manipulated, exploited, maybe even blackmailed. He turned to Julien. Did you seduce my son? Is that it? Is that what this was? The question hung like poison. Julien didn't respond. There was no defense that would sound like truth. And yet, the most outrageous thing was this: he had never touched Daniel, had never even spoken to him. And somehow that was worse. To receive this gift without ever having earned it. To be the keeper of someone's final offering when he had never even noticed the love behind it. Claire spoke then, her voice steady. He never seduced anyone. Uncle, he never even said hello. Daniel loved quietly, and we all ignored it. Julien was the only person who ever made him feel brave, even if he didn't mean to. Julien looked at her, grateful and ashamed all at once. Later, alone in a back office, the notary handed him a folder. These are yours now, he said. His shares, his accounts, and his wish. Apparently, Julien held the folder like it might vanish. He hadn't asked for this, but Daniel had given it freely. Not as payment, not as apology, but as a kind of message. A final act of courage from someone who had lived his entire life on the edge of being seen. Julien didn't know yet what he would do with the inheritance. But he knew this much: he wouldn't let it become a symbol of shame. He would find a way to turn this strange, unexpected legacy into something with meaning. Not because he owed Daniel anything, but because for the first time in his life, someone had believed he mattered without asking for anything in return. Julien didn't spend the money. Not at first. The folder sat untouched on his kitchen table for days. Some nights, he would walk past it, brushing his fingers against its edge like it might sting. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a question. What do you do with something given out of silent love? He reread Daniel's letter. Again and again. It still felt unreal, like a message from a parallel life where they had known each other, spoken, laughed. But in this one, all they had shared was space and light. One boy reading, another watching, neither daring to speak. Julien returned to the bookstore near Luxembourg Gardens. The seat by the window was still there, a little more worn, a little more sun-faded. He sat in it again, like he had all those years ago, and opened a book he no longer cared to finish. He didn't need to read, he needed to remember. In the days that followed, Julien drafted a plan, not for himself, but for Daniel. With the help of a foundation, he arranged to create the Marchand Fund, a scholarship and support program for LGBTQ+ youth studying art and literature. No long applications, no expectations, just quiet encouragement for the quiet ones. The ones who drew in sketchbooks and wrote letters they never sent. He kept only two things for himself: the framed bookmark and Daniel's last letter. On the day of the fund's announcement, Julien stood before a small group in the same bookstore, now hosting a youth writing event in Daniel's name. His hands shook as he unfolded the note one final time. He didn't read it aloud. Some things weren't meant for everyone. Instead, he looked out at the crowd of quiet faces, some curious, some shy, some already looking away, and spoke carefully. There was once a boy who loved without being seen. He gave everything, but never asked for anything back. And when he left, he gave someone like me the courage to stop hiding. He paused. I don't deserve his love, but I can try to honor it. And if even one of you ever feels the way he did, like you don't matter unless someone tells you you matter, without having to prove it. After the event, he walked home slowly. He didn't feel rich. He didn't feel heroic. He felt human, rooted, as if, for the first time, someone else's belief in him had stitched something together that had always been fraying at the edges. Julien never visited Daniel's grave. Instead, he returned to the window seat at the bookstore. Often, sometimes just to sit in the light, exactly as he had when he didn't know he was being loved. He stayed a little longer now, and once, when a boy in a navy sweater sat across from him and smiled nervously, Julien smiled back. Not as a promise, but as a beginning. Because sometimes being seen is the bravest thing we can offer. And sometimes what we inherit isn't money, but a reason to become who we were always meant to be. Have you ever discovered someone's love after they were gone? Tell us, even if it's silent. Your story might help someone else feel seen. Subscribe to Heart Stories to hear more quiet legacies, unspoken loves, and the moments that change everything.